The Making of a Ghost Town. In March 1946, Robert Odell walked into Creek Haven Elementary with a shotgun and a pistol. 12 children and a math teacher never made it home. Odell was arrested immediately following the massacre after he'd fallen down a flight of stairs. When asked why he had done it, he didn't answer. He just smiled. He was executed within the year. Creek Haven has changed a lot since then. It had been a mining town up until the 70s, when the ore depleted and the residents were forced to move away to find new work. Now it's deserted, left of the woods and the wild to overrun. The buildings still stand, including the school, and ghostly rumors have surrounded the place since it was abandoned. Supposedly, the spirits of the children can be seen in and around the school where they died. I'd heard bits and pieces about it since I was a kid. My dad had been born there, but the family left even before the mines dried up. He had no memory of it. Grandma did, though. She'd spent her whole life there, and she'd been in the school when Odell opened fire. That was the one piece of her childhood she never talked about. I was taking a film class and we'd received an assignment to shoot a mini documentary. I knew right away what I wanted to cover. "We don't say that name," I recorded her telling me. Even over the tape, I can hear the thin, disapproving line she'd pressed her lips into. "And you don't want to go there." Terrible memories left it ruined. My voice comes up after a moment of silence. "Do you remember that day?" There's a squeak of a chair as Grandma shifted uncomfortably. Of course I do. I knew all of the victims. Some had been my friends. You don't forget something like that. Never. Never. After so long, her voice was still raw with pain. I shut the tape off after. Even as a high school kid, I knew there were some things you shouldn't push. After it was done, Grandma got up and walked to the kitchen. She asked me what kind of cookies she should bake for me to take home. I didn't bring up Creek Haven with her again. That didn't put me off the project, though. I recruited my friend Nicole to act as camerawoman, and we picked a date to drive out to Creek Haven. Despite its bloody past, neither of us believed that it was truly haunted. My documentary was meant to cover its history and the birth of an urban legend. I called it The Making of a House Town. It was overcast and humid when we left. Nicole's Jeep's AC was broken, and she spent the 30-minute ride complaining about it. I was too busy focusing on my notes to really notice. I don't think I looked up until she stopped short, and my seatbelt caught me as I jerked forward. A barrier had been erected in front of the road leading into Creek Haven. I got out and filmed it and the long strip of potholed pavement behind it. I had Nicole put her 4-wheel drive to good use and directed her off-road to go around the flimsy barricade. I held the camera out the window, catching shots of the trees lining the way in and the first glimpses of houses, sagging and in disrepair, in the distance. We slowed to a stop when we reached what had once been Main Street. I had dug up old photos of the town over the years, and Nicole and I went through the pile to find ones that matched the spot we were in. I wanted a montage of then and now comparisons to open the documentary with. "So when do we get to the school?" Nicole asked. She was eager to get to the haunted part already. "Soon." Come on, Cleo. You know that's the only thing anyone's going to care about. The video's only going to be a half hour. Don't waste your time being artsy-fartsy." The tight, grim set of Grandma's expression crossed my mind as I relented. What was still an open wound for her was schoolwork fodder for us. It was a reminder to treat the subject matter with as much respect as I could manage. We followed a map I'd brought down the bumpy streets toward the school. It was eerie to drive past the sun-bleached buildings still sporting their signs and business names, as if they were just waiting to open their doors again. I kept the camcorder rolling as we turned down Dogwood toward the low stone wall that surrounded the school. It was a 2-story building, red brick and blackened windows. The small parking lot was an empty mess of weeds growing through concrete. Nickel parked just outside the front doors. The glass on one had been shattered, allowing us a view of the corridor beyond. As I started to climb out, Nicole grabbed my arm. "Someone's in there," she hissed. "Where?" "There," she said, jabbing her finger forward. In the first doorway inside. "Someone's looking out." I squinted into the darkened hallway and gasped. The outline of a person was peeking out around the doorframe. Nicole's fingers dug into my arm. We sat frozen and waited. The person didn't move. "What should we do?" Nicole asked in an uneasy whisper. The person still hadn't budged from their spot. "It could be a homeless person," she suggested. I leaned forward in my seat. "I don't think so." "Cleo, no." Despite her protests, I pushed the Jeep's door open and lifted the camcorder to my eye. In hesitant, small steps, I climbed the short stone stairway leading into the school until my suspicions were confirmed. "Cleo." I laughed and waved for her to get out of the car and join me. "It's a mannequin." "What?" She sounded doubtful. "Mannequin." "Odd. Is that supposed to make it less creepy?" "Come on, you big baby. We've got a lot to film." After some convincing, Nicole finally joined me, and we stepped through the broken glass opening. The inside was dimly lit in shades of gray that filtered through the grimy windows. The dirty, child-sized mannequin we'd seen from outside was standing just inside the first doorway, which had a sign labeling it the front office. Over its shoulder, another mannequin, this one modeled after an adult, was standing behind the desk. Another pair were seated in some chairs outside another door marked principal. "What the heck?" Nicole said from over my shoulder. I giggled nervously and filmed. She stayed close on my heels as we walked further into the school. A few child mannequins were scattered throughout the hall, one at an old-fashioned water fountain. A few were standing in a line outside a classroom door. Within the classroom, an adult mannequin had been placed in front of the chalkboard, and some of the seats had more of the smaller ones in them. They were all browned with dust and age. "This is way too weird," Nicole said. "I'm going to wait outside." "Oh, come on. Someone was just fucking around a long time ago." "Whatever. I don't care. I'm out." Nicole scurried back toward the front door, leaving me to call after her. I grumbled and kept going. Each room I passed had its own set of mannequins. They were positioned in ways that mimicked what a typical school day might have looked like. Teachers leading classes of students, an empty library where a lone mannequin was left behind the checkout desk, a cafeteria with a handful of child-sized mannequins scattered around the tables. There was even one class where a couple of kid mannequins had been made to look like they were passing a note between them. It was weird, like Nicole had said, and I couldn't deny that goosebumps had been creeping up my arms since that first child mannequin, but I told myself it was harmless. I wasn't a little kid who was going to be scared by some overgrown dolls. Not when 30% of my grade depended on it. I walked by faded, torn posters and glanced into every doorway, filming as I went. I'd have to add a voiceover later. The stairwell leading to the second floor was halfway down the hall. They still seemed sturdy enough, and I walked up them one at a time, slow and cautious the whole way. At the top of the stairs, a single adult mannequin was standing with its back to me. Someone had taped a stick that sort of resembled a handgun to its waist. A larger stick had been taped between its hands. I wrinkled my nose in distaste at the obvious symbolism and shoved the thing off to the side. It fell over with a crash that echoed down the length of the hall. I shuddered and stepped over its legs to continue on. Unlike the first floor, there was only one classroom that had any mannequins in it on this one. An adult-sized mannequin was at the front of the room, half turned with its arm raised and pointing toward the blackboard. Every seat in this class was filled by a child-sized counterpart. They were facing forward, as if paying attention to their lesson. I panned the camcorder across the class. A loud bang came suddenly from the stairwell and I jumped, instinctively turning towards it. The silence that followed rang heavily in my ears. "Mitchell," I called, "I'm up here." But my friend didn't answer. Icy sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I chewed my lip, trying to convince myself it had just been something I'd disturbed on my way up, finally toppling over. My thoughts were cut short by the soft murmur of childish whispers coming from within the classroom. Slowly, even as I screamed at myself not to, I looked back into the class. All of the mannequins' heads had turned toward the door. Their blank, pale faces were fixed on me. I stumbled back a step with a short cry, my camcorder fumbling in my hands. Something creaked, low and long, from inside the class. Suddenly I couldn't remember how to move my legs. There was a heavy thud, another, and then a third, like footsteps, and they were getting closer. A deep, guttural growl rumbled out into the hall. The footsteps were becoming quicker. I tore myself from the spot and ran screaming down the hall. At the top of the steps, my feet tangled in the legs of the mannequin I'd pushed over, and I barely managed to catch myself on the railing before pitching headlong down the stairs. Frantically, I looked back toward the classroom. Dirtied, elongated fingers had closed around the door frame. The mannequin dragged itself stiffly into the hallway. Its head turned jerkily toward me, and it growled again. I didn't look back a second time as I leapt down the stairs 2 at a time and bolted down the hall to the front door, shouting for Nicole to start. I was convinced I could hear the uneven, angry footsteps of the mannequin pursuing me out of the school. We screeched out of the parking lot and out of Creek Haven. I couldn't bring myself to review the footage until a few days later, when the fear had dwindled a bit and it seemed less real, and Nicole didn't want to see it at all. "I'm going to have nightmares enough as it is," she'd said after I told her what had happened. I sat at my desk, every light in my room on, and I plugged the camcorder into my computer. I skipped over the initial shots of the town until I got to the elementary school. Seeing the mannequins again made my heartbeat quicken, and I fast-forwarded until I got to the classroom on the 2nd floor. There was the bang which sent the camcorder jumping and off focus. It had come to rest briefly on a plaque outside the door, and I caught the word Parker before the camera was moving again and everything became a blur. My own heavy breathing and screaming drowned out any other noise. The only thing I managed to capture in my desperation to escape was a glimpse of the adult-sized mannequin standing in the hallway as I headed down the steps. I ended up turning in a documentary on a different, much duller topic, but I kept my footage from the school saved in a hidden folder. Aside from Mitchell, I was only ever brave enough to bring it up to one other person. "Grandma," I said, "I know you don't like talking about Creek Haven, but did the name Parker mean anything?" Grandma nodded once, a subtle movement. "Mr. Parker. He was my math teacher. His classroom had been on the 2nd floor. When Robert Odell began his rampage, Cyrus Parker had been in the middle of a lesson. Students, Grandma included, would later say they didn't know at first what the loud noises they heard downstairs were. Mr. Parker must have known, but he calmly told them to stay in their seats while he checked it out. The last words he spoke to the children were the same he said every day at the end of class. "Study hard, do your homework, make me proud." He had closed the door behind him. Grandma distinctly remembered the sound of the lock turning into place. The teacher in the next class over had poked her head out when the screaming began from downstairs. She watched Mr. Parker run past her toward a strange man who just had stepped onto the 2nd floor landing. It wasn't until the shotgun blast that she realized what was happening. Mr. Parker took it in the stomach, and he growled. He had jumped onto the shooter, and both fell down the stairs. He died lying atop that monster. Grandma looked away and dabbed her eyes, held him down until there was no life left in him. If he hadn't, she trailed off, and I didn't ask any more. I don't know who put the mannequins in the school or why. Maybe it was an art project. Maybe it was an art project. Memorial that never panned Man 8. I've never found an answer. But 13 innocent lives were lost in March of 1946. Since then, it's been said that the ghosts of the children haunt. I believe it. And I know they're not alone. I know that Mr. Parker never got to leave, either. He remains, watching over those children now the same way he did then. God help anyone who ever tries to harm them again. Next story. My dad's ghost story. I first heard this story when I was in college. I had come home for a winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunters program on TV, just for laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff. When you watch the programs on the TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch and try to get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was the kind of guy who would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Sort of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" "Yup." His reply was so casual it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, a bit taken aback. "Like it just doesn't really seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over what I had just said. "Yeah," he replied eventually, "but I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is like me. He likes to tell stories. I could retell most of his stories from memory, just because he would tell them so frequently to anyone who would listen. Yet here was a story I had never heard, of an event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't know if I believe it or not, but when someone who is so influential in your life, someone who seems so logical and so down to earth, tells you something like this, it calls into question what you believe and why. Though he never brings it up, when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true, no exaggeration, and no doubt in his mind about what happened. Here it is, told from his point of view. It was back in the house in Tacoma, where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for a weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the 3 of us. It was in the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark yet. We were talking like normal when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come in here for a moment?" I remember she seemed worried. Her voice was shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face, got up, and joined my mom in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few moments, they came out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's come up, and we have to go out for a bit," my mom said. "There's dessert in the fridge. Help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. I'll wash them when we get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face that it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out the door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate, despite my mom's instructions. Then I went into the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa and opened one of my school books and began to relax. Hours went by and my parents still hadn't come back. It was now around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom, when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out, whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage, decided to investigate. I climbed the steps. Now I have to say I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling. Actually, to the contrary, I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreboding. It felt almost warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage was an old rocking chair, one that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of many possessions she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in her room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old bird cage was displaying a similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet, metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside, it was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the bird cage, yet there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed, stacks of paper and the like. After a while I gave up and looked back at the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest. The chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand and the chair was calm and quiet, but as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I had said before, I wasn't really creeped out. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still slowly swinging open and closed. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty now for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I was about halfway down, I heard the metallic creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to it, swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure I had latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a bird cage aren't really the harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with a last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while, and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise and continued reading. It was a little after midnight when I heard my parents pull into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mom was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes to this day that before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay him one last visit. Next story. The Little Ghost. When the little ghost first started coming to me, he whispered nice things that made me feel good. You have pretty hands. I love how you do your nails. How did you get your skin to be so smooth? He stayed with me all day and all night. As the days went by, though, I must have done something to make the ghost angry. Instead of mawkish pleasantries, the messages grew negative. I've seen other girls with prettier hands. What happened to your nails? I'm sorry your skin looks so dry nowadays. I started to get upset. I'd grown fond of the little ghost. Since he'd always been so positive, it was comforting. But once he started to get mean, I wondered what I'd done wrong. I didn't want my ghost to feel like I'd disappointed him. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw the ghost in the mirror. He looked up at me as I brushed my teeth and said with sadness in his voice, "Your cuticles are so ragged, ugly." I looked down at my hands. He was right. I hadn't been taking care of them at all since I started that art class. Bits of skin and hangnails sprouted from each cuticle. They were red and angry. "Can you get rid of them for me?" The ghost sounded so hopeful. I couldn't bear to make him feel like I wasn't the good person he initially believed me to be. What if he left? I grabbed the corner of a thick hangnail on the side of my left middle finger. I started to pull backward. It hurt terribly. The ghost, his eyes brimming with hope, told me I was doing such a great job. Even through the pain of what I was doing, I was overwhelmed by relief. I was finally doing something right. I kept working on the hangnail. After a little while, I pulled a thin strip from the side of my finger, up my hand, and across my arm to the inside of my elbow. It stung terribly, but as tears of joy flooded from the ghost's eyes, I started to wonder if things were getting back to normal. "Your hand is looking a tiny bit better," the ghost informed me. "Maybe someday you can be pretty again." I spent the next hour tearing the skin and nails from my fingers. Even though they bled and I thought they looked terrible, the ghost smiled and assured me I had the hands of a beautiful angel. Through my tears, I smiled. As the days went by, I did what I could to make the ghost happy. Sometimes he'd get in a bad mood. Just the other night, he told me the skin on my lips was ugly and chapped. I pulled the chapped skin away. Some of it went pretty far up my cheeks before it tore, but it was okay. The ghost talked on and on about how kissable I'd become. When my parents arrived at my apartment this morning, they hadn't said they were coming, but it was a nice surprise. It had been a while, but when they saw my face and my hands, they were horrified. My mom sobbed, "What happened to your beautiful face?" My dad, almost at the same time, exclaimed, "Oh my God, your hands are ruined." Tears started to leak from my eyes. Off in the corner, my ghost sighed, "They're the ones who make us so sad, aren't they?" I agreed. 10 minutes later, as I worked to saw their bodies into small parts, I asked the ghost if he'd be happier now that they weren't around. No answer. I turned around to see if he was listening. The little ghost was gone. Next story. Mr. Ghost. Host. In the spring of 1953, when I was 9 years old, I saw my brother die. I'll remember that day for the rest of my life. The memory has never left me, and it never will. Part of it is the trauma, the slow, insidious realization that he was gone, that crept into my life afterwards. But there is more to it that I don't talk about. I've held on to it for years, and I don't want to hold on to it any longer. It was the 10th of April. School had just finished, and Charlie and I were walking home like we always did. Those were good times. Mom always had a snack waiting for us. Good old cookies and milk. Charlie was the kind of kid with a smile that could light up a room. He was a year above me, but he seemed to be full of more energy than I could have mustered. Outside, we'd play superheroes, like the ones in the comic books. He was always Captain America, and I was Bucky Barnes. With wild ginger hair, freckles, and sparkling green eyes, he didn't look like much of a superhero, but he sure knew the part well. After our snack, he'd grab the garbage can lid, and I'd grab my BB gun, and we'd go out to fight the bad guys on the front lawn. We'd been hoping to play like that when we got home, and Charlie was ahead of me, looking back and yelling for me to keep up. "Come on, Felix, Mom's waiting." I remember the smile on his face. I remember seeing the green 1953 Chevy Corvette round the corner behind him and come barreling down the road. For a moment, I didn't think much of it. Why should I have? The Corvette should have passed us by with no issue. Sure, he was going a little fast, but there should have been nothing to worry about. Charlie turned to look as he heard the scream of rubber on asphalt. I can only imagine he was admiring the Corvette. We used to think they were the coolest. When I heard the bang of the tire, I didn't know what it was at first. The plume of debris was a little shocking, and it distracted me just long enough to realize that the Corvette was headed our way. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face, which had frozen into a panicked look as he tried to regain control of his car. Charlie didn't even have time to move. The Corvette jumped the curb, hitting him head-on. He was thrown back like a toy as the Corvette went over the sidewalk and down into the shallow ditch beside us, burying him beneath it. I had felt nothing but the wind as it had sailed past me, and heard nothing but the scrape of metal. Tossing my backpack to the ground, I ran towards the wreckage to tend to my brother. I could still see his face, contorted into a mask of agony. The Corvette was crushing his lower half, and you could tell he was in pain from his screams. Those screams still haunt me today. I was unable to speak. His pained howls made speaking almost useless. I stole a glance inside the sports Corvette. The windshield was cracked and I saw blood. The driver wouldn't be helping us anytime soon. Felix. I could hear his voice, fragile and pained. He held pleas. The tears streamed down his cheeks, and I didn't want to leave him, but I knew there was no choice. I ran back up to the side of the road and looked for a passing car, somebody to help us. Anybody. Only moments ago there had been other cars on the street, but now everybody was gone. The world seemed dimmer. The sunlight seemed to be cutting through a thick fog that had not been there before. There was no sound other than Charlie's screams, which quickly subsided into whimpers. I looked around frantically. In the distance, I could see a figure in the fog. I waved at him and yelled, "Hey, mister, we need help, please." The figure in the distance didn't come any faster. I called out for him again, waving my arms to grab his attention. "Sir, please come fast, we need help." I looked down at Charlie. He was so horribly pale, his hands on the grille of the crashed Corvette that pinned him. From behind me, I heard a high and squeaky voice. "Well, ain't that a little bit of a predicament?" I jumped and looked in the direction of the voice. It was the man from the distance. How had he gotten here so fast by just walking? Had he run towards us when I wasn't looking? He was dressed all in black. A heavy black coat, a black fedora, and black leather gloves. He looked like a businessman on his way home from work. "Sir," I said, my voice shaking, "please, we need to call somebody, a hospital, something." The man laughed. It was such a carefree sound, and it filled me with rage. How could he laugh at a moment like this? "My dear boy, a hospital won't save your friend now." "Oh no, I'm afraid he's a little too injured for that." "What do you mean?" I asked, panicked. "Well, your friend is going to die, I'm afraid," the man said, "but that's why I'm here." He extended a gloved hand towards me. I didn't shake it. All I could do was stare. When I didn't move, he patted my shoulder and brushed past me, making his way down the ditch and towards the car, moving casually, as if Charlie's cries for help meant nothing to him. I didn't have the capacity to speak, trying to process all he had said. I wasn't sure if this man was insane or sincere. He knelt down beside my brother, his smile carefree and infectious. "Don't worry, dear boy," he said, caressing Charlie's forehead, and just like that he stopped his tormented shrieks. His body went limp, and he let out an almost relaxed sigh. There. Let's get you out of this awful place." The man grabbed Charlie by his arms. Charlie had been pulled out from under the car in one piece, and he was standing like nothing happened. I called his name and reached out to hug him, but the man stood between us, blocking my way. "I can't allow that," he warned me. "I'm sorry." "Why not?" I begged, and his expression turned solemn. "You aren't supposed to be here. My work isn't exactly for prying eyes, but here you are all the same. I don't question the why of it. Sometimes these things just are, and there is purpose in everything. Besides, I really don't mind the company, but I can't allow you to touch him. He is no longer of your world." Charlie didn't say anything to me. He didn't even look at me. His eyes had a dead, ignorant look to them. The man brushed past me and opened the door of the fallen car. He thrust his hand in and pulled the driver from his seat. He was only a teenager, but I was horrified when I saw him. His neck was bent at an impossible angle. I could see bones pressed against the skin. His neck had to have been broken. He shouldn't have been alive. The man remained indifferent to the seemingly fatal wound on the driver and simply placed his hands on his cheeks, and with a sudden movement jerked his head back into place, and there was a sickening crack. All better, he said sweetly and looked at me. What happens to me? I asked. He'd said that Charlie was going to die, and the driver was clearly dead too. But then, if I was seeing him, was I also dead? Was he going to hurt me for seeing him? Whatever exactly he was. Oh, I'm not going to hurt you, and you're very much alive, Felix, he said and offered a warm smile. I hadn't said anything to him. How did he know what I was thinking? I was too stunned to speak. Very rarely do humans see me. They don't want to see me, and what I do. What do you do? I asked, my voice shaking. It was just one of a million questions I had. Well, I'm something of a chauffeur, he said. I pick people up and I drop them off. I'll be picking you up one day too. How do you know my name? I stammered. He didn't reply. He smiled and he took the hands of both Charlie and the teenage driver. Don't you worry about it. That won't be for a while. For now I've got to run. I'm a very busy man, you know. With that, he led both Charlie and the driver back up to the road. A black car was waiting there. It hadn't been there before. An older model that later in life I'd recognize as a 1935 Duesenberg convertible. He put Charlie and the driver into the back seat before climbing behind the wheel. The last I saw of him was a friendly wave he gave me before he drove off. That was it. I sat down on the grass, my back to the car, and started to cry. I looked down at where Charlie had been, and to my surprise, he was still there. But he wasn't screaming. He wasn't even moving. He lay there, pinned beneath the vehicle, with his eyes staring vacantly up into the sky. I was still in the ditch when the police came, and when they took Charlie away. I remember watching them take the driver of the car out too. His neck was broken the exact same way it had been when that man had taken him out earlier, but nobody just cracked his head back into place. The wound had been as fatal as I'd thought. I had no idea what I'd witnessed until much later. Even today, I'm still not so sure. Every now and then, I'll be driving down the road and I'll see a car accident. Parked right beside the police cars is a black Duesenberg convertible. I don't think anybody else sees it. Once I saw the same gaunt man, and I swore he looked at me and winked. I've taken to referring to him as Mr. Ghost. It's the only name that seems to fit the man. On the streets, sometimes I'll see the car driving past. Mr. Ghost's car. I assume he's on his way to other business. People are always dying, you know. I learned a lot about the world that day, maybe more than most people know. I learned about the methods of death. But every day I wake up, I'm thankful not to see him standing over my bed, hand extended and carefree grin on his face. I know that is what's going to happen one day, and I just hope I'm ready when it does. Next story. Ghosts are good guys. We are all scared of ghosts. Wait, let me rephrase that. You are all scared of ghosts. Ever since I was young, I could see them. I'm afraid it is no sixth sense stuff, and I have never had to deal with a dead psychiatrist who didn't know he was dead. I'm not sorry if I just spoiled the movie for you. Shame on you if you haven't seen it already. Real ghosts know they are dead. At least I think they do. They never really talk to me, but I guess they would look more confused or something. The thing is, I can't see them all the time. For some reason, my left eye has to be closed in order for me to see ghosts. Or spirits. Whatever you want me to call them, I guess I found out about my talent pretty young because I honestly do not remember not seeing them. Sometimes they are terrifying. Sometimes they are sad. Sometimes they just chill. I'm not scared of them anymore. Okay, to be honest, they were scary at first. I did not appreciate a guy with a freaking hole in his head chilling in my room. Just get out, scary, creepy guy. You don't pay rent here and you're dead. Go haunt a cemetery or something. I have seen enough horror movies to know you want to possess me. But after one incident, I stopped being afraid. And I want to tell you about it so you can stop being afraid. So I assume you all know Ghost Adventures show. 3 guys going to scary places, getting locked in for a night, recording ghostly stuff. Yeah, these guys. I had the pleasure of meeting them because my dad works in one of the famous haunted hotels in our country. The irony is not lost to me, and they were supposed to shoot an episode in that. They interviewed my dad before their lockdown, and I chatted with their catering staff while waiting for him. As far as I understand, everything went as normal. They went inside, the hotel owner locked them in, and they ventured to into hotel to get to their hotspots, or whatever these are called. You know, places where people report ghost sightings. But in the morning when the owner came back to unlock the door, they were nowhere to be found. First he tries to find them himself, but then he has to call the director of the show to inform him that his stars are missing. Me and my dad found out during breakfast when he called to ask him to assist with the search. Naturally, I go with him. Looking for lost ghost hunters seemed more interesting than whatever plans I had for that day. When we arrive, everyone is panicking. Some want to call the police, some want to call a priest, some just want to burn the whole place to the ground and then call a priest. My dad talks to the director for a bit to find out where they pinpointed the hotspots and decides to start his search there. I follow him. Nobody really pays attention to me. We go to one of the rooms in the more luxurious part of the hotel. That damn place even has a fireplace which no one is allowed to use. When I ask my dad sarcastically if he thinks they are hiding in it, or what, he tells me to shut my mouth or he'll send me home. I think my question is pretty legitimate considering there isn't any place where they could be hiding, or where someone could stash their corpses. Then I think, wait, so if they are dead, I might be able to see their ghosts, right? Don't get me wrong, not everyone who dies gets to be a ghost. I just wanted to give it a chance. So I close my left eye. Almost immediately there is a woman in Victorian clothes inches from my face. Her left eyeball is missing. I try to hide my short scream as coughing, but my dad still looks at me weird. Well, I'm sorry, Dad, but there is a ghost in the room, so give me a break, okay? Fortunately, she backs away. I figure she was just trying to get my attention. She walks through my dad, who shivers, and I almost expect him to make some comment about a temperature drop. The lady stops next to the fireplace and points at it while looking me dead in the eye. I don't understand, but still follow her to take a closer look. The fireplace is made of tiles, and she just happens to be pointing at one which looks weirdly misshapen. Like I said, I'd seen enough horror movies. So I press the tile, and I kid you not, the whole fireplace revolves. And guess who is shivering, dehydrated, and tired in the hidden room behind it? When finally found, ghost hunters get their much-needed medical attention. It was Sweersthavaithane, the Thanchers Adventures merchandise, I guess. My dad never looked prouder than in the moment I saved some Teeve stars. I tell them I was screwing around waiting for my dad to finish searching the room. Lucky accident, they call it. Turns out that ghost hunters accidentally pressed the tile, and when they went to investigate, the fireplace revolved back to its place, and they were trapped. No switch from the inside. So there you go. Ghosts don't want to harm you, they are here to save you when you fuck up. I swear to God, the dead lady looked so satisfied with herself when we found them.